Captain James Harrison stood at attention in the Windsor Castle courtyard, his red uniform pristine despite the morning drizzle. 23 years of service to the Crown had prepared him for many things, but not for what was about to happen next. "Captain Harrison," Colonel Matthews called out, approaching with a manila envelope clutched in his weathered hands, "we have a rather unusual situation." James turned sharply, his black boots clicking against the wet cobblestones. The colonel's face was grave, more serious than usual. In all his years serving under Matthews, James had never seen him look quite this concerned. "Sir?" James responded, his voice steady despite the growing unease in his chest. "The Americans have issued a challenge," Matthews said, extending the envelope. "They want to put our training methods to the test against their own." James took the envelope, feeling its weight. Something about this felt different from the usual joint exercises or diplomatic visits. The paper was thick, official, and bore multiple seals he didn't recognize. "What kind of test, sir?" Matthews paused, glancing around the courtyard as if checking for unwanted ears. "The U.S. Army Ranger School assessment. They want to see if our Royal Guards can handle their most demanding physical and mental challenges." James felt his eyebrows rise involuntarily. The U.S. Army Rangers were legendary for their brutal training programs. Stories of their grueling tests had become somewhat mythical in military circles worldwide. No foreign soldier had ever been formally invited to attempt their full assessment battery. "They're serious about this?" James asked, breaking the seal on the envelope. "Deadly serious. The invitation came through the highest channels. The Pentagon, the State Department, even the White House has signed off on this." Matthews stepped closer, lowering his voice. "But here's the thing, Harrison. They don't think we'll pass." James pulled out the documents, scanning the dense text. Physical endurance tests, psychological evaluations, tactical assessments, survival scenarios. The list seemed endless. At the bottom of the page, a handwritten note caught his attention. "Looking forward to seeing how British ceremony translates to American warfare." The insult was subtle but unmistakable. "How many of us are they expecting?" James asked, his jaw tightening. "Just one," Matthews replied. "They want our best. Someone who represents everything the Royal Guard stands for." James looked up from the documents, meeting his colonel's eyes. The implication was clear. 23 years of service, countless commendations, perfect disciplinary record. He was the obvious choice, but that didn't take the prospect any less daunting. "What's the real reason behind this, sir? Americans don't issue challenges like this without cause." Matthews sighed, removing his cap and running a hand through his grey hair. "There's been talk in their military circles. Some of their generals believe our ceremonial duties have made us soft. They think we're all show and no substance." The words stung more than James cared to admit. He'd spent over 2 decades proving himself, from Northern Ireland to Afghanistan, from ceremonial duties to active combat. The idea that anyone would question the effectiveness of the Royal Guard training rankled him deeply. "When do they want an answer?" James asked. "Tomorrow morning." The test itself would take place in 3 weeks at Fort Benning, Georgia. Full media coverage, international military observers, the works. Matthews replaced his cap, straightening it carefully. "This isn't just about proving a point, Harrison. This is about national pride." James folded the documents carefully, sliding them back into the envelope. The weight of expectation settled on his shoulders like a familiar burden. He'd carried the honor of the Guard before, but never quite like this. "I'll need to see the full specifications," he said finally. "Already arranged." "But James," Matthews paused, using his first name for the first time in years, "you should know what you're up against. The last 5 international candidates who attempted this assessment all failed the first 48 hours. The challenge was set, the gauntlet thrown. In 3 weeks, Captain James Harrison would discover if 23 years of Royal Guard training could measure up to the most demanding military assessment in the world. The basement of the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, had never seen anything quite like this. For the past week, Captain Harrison had been subjected to a training regimen that pushed beyond anything in the standard Royal Guard manual. "Again," shouted Sergeant Major Williams, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "The Americans won't wait for you to catch your breath. James hauled himself up the rope for the 15th time, his arms screaming in protest. Sweat dripped steadily onto the mat below, forming a small puddle that had grown throughout the morning session. This wasn't the ceremonial fitness he was accustomed to. This was something altogether more brutal. Dr. Sarah Chen, the military psychologist assigned to his preparation, watched from the corner, making notes on her tablet. Her presence had become a constant over the past days, evaluating his mental state as much as his physical capabilities. "Your stress responses are interesting," she had told him during their first session. "Royal Guards are trained for precision under pressure, but the Americans will test your adaptability when everything goes wrong." Everything going wrong. That phrase had been haunting James for days now. The intelligence reports on the U.S. Army Ranger assessment had arrived in a thick folder that made for sobering reading. Sleep deprivation lasting up to 72 hours, nutritional restrictions that would leave candidates operating on minimal calories, psychological pressure designed to break even the strongest minds. "Tell me about the worst day of your military career," Dr. Chen had asked during yesterday's session. James had thought carefully before answering. "Helmand Province, 2018. We lost 2 men in an IED attack. I had to coordinate the evacuation while under enemy fire for 6 hours straight." "And how did you handle the pressure?" "Training took over. Royal Guard discipline. You do what needs to be done." Dr. Chen had made another note. "The Americans will try to create situations where your training doesn't apply, where there's no clear protocol to follow." That was the part that worried James most. Royal Guard training was built on tradition, on doing things the proper way, the time-tested way, but from what he'd learned about the American assessment, they seemed to take perverse pleasure in throwing out the rulebook. Colonel Matthews entered the training room, carrying a fresh stack of documents. "New intelligence from our liaisons at the Pentagon," he announced. "The Americans have modified their standard assessment specifically for you." James paused mid-pull-up, hanging from the bar. "Modified how?" "They've added elements designed to test what they call ceremonial soldier adaptability. Apparently they want to see if someone trained in precision and protocol can handle chaos and improvisation." Sergeant Major Williams snorted. "Sounds like they're trying to stack the deck." "Maybe," Matthews replied, "but it also means they're taking this seriously. They wouldn't modify their assessment unless they thought it was necessary." James dropped from the bar, his arms trembling slightly. "What kind of modifications?" Matthews consulted his documents. "Leadership scenarios with incomplete information. Survival situations where the standard procedures don't apply. Something called protocol disruption training where they deliberately give you conflicting orders." The room fell silent. Every soldier understood the challenge this represented. Military training was built on clear chains of command, on following orders without question. But if the Americans were going to deliberately create confusion— "There's more," Matthews continued. "They've invited military attachés from 12 different countries to observe. The French, Germans, Israelis, even the Russians are sending representatives." Dr. Chen looked up from her tablet. "That changes the psychological pressure significantly. It's not just about proving British capabilities anymore. It's about performing under international scrutiny." James felt his stomach tighten. Bad enough to potentially fail in front of the Americans, but to do so with the entire international military community watching would be a humiliation beyond measure. "What are our chances?" James asked quietly. The question hung in the air. Nobody wanted to answer it directly. Finally, Sergeant Major Williams spoke up. 23 years of service, sir. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. Commendations for valor, leadership, and tactical excellence. If anyone can do this, it's you." But James could see the doubt in his eyes. They all knew the statistics. International candidates had a failure rate approaching 90%, and those were candidates who had trained specifically for Ranger assessment their entire careers. "I need to know everything," James said finally. "Every detail about their methods, their expectations, their psychological tactics. If I'm going to represent the Royal Guard, I'm going to do it properly." Matthews nodded. "Already arranged. We have a former US Ranger instructor flying in tomorrow. He'll spend the next 2 weeks putting you through a simulation program. And if I fail..." A question nobody wanted to ask, but everyone was thinking. Colonel Matthews straightened his shoulders. Then we'll know we gave it our best effort. But James, failure isn't an option here. Too much is riding on this. As the training session ended and James headed to the showers, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something far more significant than a simple military assessment. This was about more than personal achievement or even national pride. This was about proving that tradition and innovation could coexist, that ceremonial and combat effectiveness weren't mutually exclusive. In 2 weeks, he would discover if 23 years of Royal Guard service had prepared him for the most challenging test of his military career. The Georgia heat hit James like a physical blow as he stepped off the military transport at Fort Benning. Even at 6 in the morning, the humidity was oppressive, clinging to his uniform and making every breath feel thick and labored. "Welcome to the home of the infantry, Captain Harrison," called out a voice with a distinct southern drawl. James turned to see a tall, lean officer approaching. The man's uniform was immaculate, but his eyes held the kind of hardness that came from years of pushing soldiers beyond their limits. "Major Rick Thompson, U.S. Army Rangers," the officer said, extending a hand. "I'll be your primary assessor for the next 72 hours. James shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and evaluating stare. "Captain James Harrison, Her Majesty's Royal Guard. Thank you for the opportunity." "Opportunity?" Thompson's smile was thin. "That's an interesting way to put it. Most candidates consider this more of an ordeal." A small convoy of military vehicles waited nearby, along with what appeared to be a considerable media presence. James counted at least 6 television crews, numerous photographers, and several individuals in civilian clothing, who had the unmistakable bearing of foreign military observers. "Quite a crowd," James observed. "Word gets around. It's not every day we get to test a Royal Guard." Thompson's tone was neutral, but James detected an undercurrent of skepticism. The international military community is very interested in the results. As they walked toward the vehicles, James spotted familiar faces among the observers. Colonel François Dubois from the French Foreign Legion gave him a subtle nod. Major Hans Müller from the German Special Forces offered a slight smile. Even Captain Yuki Tanaka from the Japanese Self-Defense Forces was present, her expression unreadable. "No pressure," James muttered under his breath. "What was that?" Thompson asked. "Nothing, sir, just appreciating the turnout." The convoy moved through the sprawling base, passing training facilities that looked more like obstacle courses designed by sadists than legitimate military installations. James had seen similar setups during his own training, but the American versions seemed particularly unforgiving. "We'll start with the physical assessment," Thompson explained as they drove. "Standard Army physical fitness test, modified for Ranger standards. Push-ups, sit-ups, 2-mile run. Nothing you've ever done before." James nodded, though he suspected the American definition of standard would be considerably more demanding than anything he'd experienced. "After that, we move into the psychological evaluation phase. Written tests, stress interviews, scenario-based assessments. We want to understand how you process information under pressure." The vehicle pulled up to a large building that looked more like a warehouse than a testing facility. Through the windows, James could see various pieces of equipment arranged in what appeared to be assessment stations. "And then?" James asked. Thompson's smile became genuinely predatory. "And then the real fun begins. 72 hours of continuous evaluation. Combat scenarios, leadership challenges, survival situations. You'll be pushed to your absolute limits and then pushed further." They exited the vehicle, and James immediately noticed the cameras following their every move. This wasn't just a military assessment, it was a public spectacle. "The media attention makes you uncomfortable," Thompson observed. "Not uncomfortable, just aware that failure would be very public."
"Failure usually is, but so is success."
Thompson led him toward the building. "Tell me, Captain, what do you think is the biggest difference between Royal Guard training and what you're about to experience?" James considered the question carefully. Royal Guard training emphasizes precision, protocol, and maintaining standards under all circumstances. From what I understand, Ranger training focuses more on adaptability and individual initiative. That's a diplomatic way of putting it. Most of your European colleagues would say we're undisciplined cowboys, who don't respect proper military procedure. And what would you say about European military training? Thompson paused at the building entrance. I'd say it produces excellent soldiers who perform beautifully when everything goes according to plan. But warfare rarely goes according to plan. The comment stung because it contained an element of truth that James couldn't ignore. Royal Guard training was indeed built around maintaining standards and following established procedures, but combat was chaotic, unpredictable, and unforgiving of rigid thinking. Inside the building, the assessment stations were even more intimidating than they had appeared from outside. Each area was designed to test different aspects of military capability, from pure physical endurance to complex tactical decision-making. We'll start in 30 minutes, Thompson announced. That gives you time to change into assessment gear and mentally prepare. As James headed toward the changing area, he passed a group of American soldiers who were obviously there to observe. Their conversations died as he approached, replaced by appraising stares that felt like physical weight. "Think he'll make it past the first day?" one of them asked. "Not quite quietly enough." "British soldiers are tough," another replied. "But this isn't about toughness. This is about adapting when everything you know stops working." James pretended not to hear, but the words followed him into the changing room. "Everything you know stops working." That phrase captured his deepest fear about this assessment. As he changed into the provided gear, James reflected on the journey that had brought him here. 23 years of service, countless hours of training, a lifetime of dedication to military excellence. But in 30 minutes, all of that would be put to the ultimate test. The real question wasn't whether he could pass the American assessment. The real question was whether a lifetime of Royal Guard discipline could adapt to meet challenges that had no precedent in his experience. Outside, he could hear the murmur of the gathering crowd, the click of cameras, and the low conversations of international military observers. The world was watching, waiting to see if British military tradition could measure up to American innovation. In 30 minutes he would begin to find out. Hour 18 of the assessment felt like hour 1800. James lay flat on his stomach in the Georgia mud, his rifle trained on a target he could barely see through the artificial fog machine that had been running for the past 6 hours. "Movement, 2 o'clock, whispered the voice in his earpiece. "Hostile forces approaching your position. You have 30 seconds to decide, engage or withdraw." James's mind raced through the tactical considerations. His fictional unit was surrounded, low on ammunition, and operating behind enemy lines. Standard Royal Guard protocol would dictate a fighting withdrawal to regroup with friendly forces. But there were no friendly forces in this scenario, and withdrawal wasn't an option with civilians trapped in the building behind him. "Engaging," he whispered back, adjusting his position. "Negative. New intelligence indicates civilians in the target building. Collateral damage. Unacceptable. Find another solution." James felt his jaw clench. This was the third time in the past hour that the scenario parameters had changed mid-mission. It was clearly designed to test his ability to adapt when standard procedures became impossible. Through his scope, he could see the enemy soldiers moving closer. In reality, they were US Army instructors playing roles, but the psychological pressure was real enough. Miss this decision, and the entire assessment could be over. "Request permission to attempt negotiation," he said finally. A pause. Then, "Explain your reasoning." "Hostile forces may not be aware of civilian presence. If I can establish communication, I might be able to negotiate safe passage for non-combatants." Another pause, longer this time. James could almost hear the assessors discussing his response. "Permission granted, but if negotiation fails, you still need to neutralize the threat without civilian casualties." James felt sweat dripping into his eyes despite the cool morning air. This was exactly the kind of impossible scenario that American training seemed to specialize in. No clear right answer, no standard protocol to follow, just the demand-pinder solution that didn't exist in any manual. He keyed his radio to the scenario frequency. "This is British Army Captain Harrison. I need to speak with your unit commander." The response came quickly. "This is Lieutenant Rodriguez. What do you want, Captain?" "I want to discuss the civilians in the building behind my position. I think we can find a solution that works for everyone." "What civilians?" James felt his heart sink. Either the enemy commander was lying, or the civilians were intelligence that only his side possessed. Both possibilities made his situation exponentially more complicated. Lieutenant, I have reliable intelligence that there are non-combatants in this area. I'm proposing a temporary ceasefire to allow for safe evacuation. I don't know anything about civilians, Captain. My orders are to secure this position. You have 2 minutes to surrender, or we're coming in. The radio went silent, leaving James with an impossible choice. Engage and risk civilian casualties, surrender and fail the mission, or find a third option that probably didn't exist. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to think beyond his training. What would work here? What solution existed outside the standard military playbook? Then it hit him. The building behind him wasn't just a civilian shelter. It was also the high ground. If he could get inside without being detected, he could establish a defensive position that would force the enemy to reconsider their approach. Control, this is Harrison. I'm going to attempt infiltration of the building to establish overwatch position. Negative, Harrison. Intelligence indicates the building may be booby-trapped. Of course it was. James almost laughed at the absurdity of the situation. Civilians inside, booby traps throughout, enemy forces closing in, and no backup coming. This was stress testing at its most extreme. Control, I need guidance. Current situation appears to have no viable solution within standard operational parameters. A long pause, then a different voice came on the radio, one James didn't recognize.
Captain Harrison, this is Colonel Davis, Senior Assessor. You're correct that there's no standard solution to this scenario. That's the point. We need to see how you think when all your training becomes a burns.
The admission was both relieving and terrifying. They were deliberately creating impossible situations to see how he would react. Colonel, requesting permission to improvise beyond standard protocols. Permission granted. But remember, you're still responsible for the outcomes of your decisions. James took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 23 years of military discipline warring with the demand for creative thinking. Everything in his background told him to follow established procedures, to stick with proven methods. But proven methods weren't working here. He made his decision. Rising from his position, James began moving toward the enemy forces with his rifle held high in a non-threatening position. It was a massive risk. They could shoot him on sight. But it was also completely unexpected. Lieutenant Rodriguez, he called out as he approached. I'm coming forward under a flag of truce. I have a proposal. The enemy soldiers raised their weapons, but their commander held up a hand. This better be good, Captain. It is. You want this position, I want to protect civilians. What if we work together to evacuate the non-combatants, and then settled this militarily? Rodriguez looked confused. That's not how this works. Maybe it should be. Your orders are to secure the position. Mine are to protect civilians. We can both succeed if we think creatively. The scenario ground to a halt as the assessors tried to figure out how to respond to a solution that existed completely outside their parameters. James had taken a military exercise and turned it into a diplomatic negotiation. His earpiece crackled. Captain Harrison, report to the assessment center immediately. This scenario is concluded. As James walked back toward the building, he wondered if he had just passed or failed spectacularly. The American faces around him were unreadable, but he could sense that something significant had just happened. The real test wasn't whether he could follow their rules. It was whether he could rewrite them when necessary. The interrogation room was deliberately uncomfortable. Harsh fluorescent lighting cast sharp shadows across the metal table, and the temperature seemed to fluctuate between stifling and freezing every few minutes. James had been sitting in the same chair for 3 hours, facing a rotating series of questioners who seemed determined to break down his mental defenses. Tell me about Afghanistan, said the current interrogator, a woman with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. Specifically, tell me about the decision that cost 2 men their lives. James felt his chest tighten. They had clearly done their homework, digging into his service record to find the moments that still haunted him years later. IED attack on a convoy escort mission, he said steadily. I made the tactical decision to pursue the attackers rather than secure the blast site immediately. And that decision led to casualties.
Yes.
Do you still think it was the right decision? James was quiet for a long moment. This was the question that had kept him awake countless nights, the doubt that gnawed at him despite official commendations for his actions that day. "I think it was the decision I made with the information I had at the time," he said finally. "That's not what I asked." The interrogator leaned forward, her gaze intense. "I asked if you still think it was right. Not whether it was understandable, not whether it was reasonable, right or wrong." James met her stare. Military decisions aren't always about right and wrong. Sometimes they're about choosing between bad options and worse options.
How convenient.
When outcomes are acceptable, blame the situation rather than the decision-maker. The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. James could feel his temper rising, which was exactly what they wanted. This wasn't about gathering information. It was about applying psychological pressure to see how he would react. "I accept responsibility for my decisions," he said carefully, "but I don't accept that every tragic outcome represents a failure of leadership." "Tell me about failure," the interrogator said, switching tactics abruptly. "What's the biggest failure of your military career?" James considered the question. They clearly wanted him to revisit painful memories, to find emotional vulnerabilities they could exploit. But something about the directness of the approach made him suspicious. Because failure reveals character. Success can be luck, circumstances, or good subordinates. But how a person handles failure shows who they really are. It was a fair point, and James found himself actually considering the question seriously rather than just trying to avoid psychological traps. "Northern Ireland, 2019, he said. "I was assigned to train local police forces in crowd control techniques. There was a riot that got out of hand, and my training protocols proved apatite for the situation." "What happened?" "Property damage, injuries on both sides, complete breakdown of public order. The techniques I had taught worked fine in controlled environments, but real riots don't follow training scenarios." The interrogator made notes. "How did you handle it?" "I revised the entire training program, brought in experts who had actual riot experience, not just theoretical knowledge. Admitted that my initial approach had been insufficient." "That must have been difficult for someone with your background. Royal Guards aren't typically known for admitting mistakes." The comment was clearly designed to provoke him, but James found himself nodding instead. "You're right. Royal Guard culture doesn't encourage admitting failure. We're trained to maintain standards, to project confidence, to never show doubt." "And is that a problem?" James was quiet for a long moment, considering the question more deeply than he had expected to in an interrogation room. "Sometimes," he admitted, "confidence is essential for leadership, but overconfidence can be deadly. There's a difference between maintaining standards and refusing to adapt when circumstances change." The interrogator sat back, and James had the distinct impression that he had just said something significant. Her questioning style shifted subtly, becoming less adversarial and more exploratory. "How do you handle situations where Royal Guard protocols don't apply?" "I'm learning that those situations are more common than I initially believed," James said honestly. "Traditional military training assumes certain parameters, certain chains of command, certain operational environments. But modern warfare doesn't always fit those assumptions, such as negotiating with enemy forces instead of just engaging them, such as finding diplomatic solutions to military problems, such as admitting when established procedures aren't working." James realized as he spoke that he was describing exactly what had happened during the scenario exercise earlier. He had abandoned standard protocols in favor of creative problem-solving, and apparently that had been the right choice. "One more question," the interrogator said. "If you could change one thing about Royal Guard training, what would it be?" James thought carefully. This felt like a question that could have significant implications for his assessment results. "I would add more emphasis on adaptability," he said finally. "We excel at maintaining standards under pressure, but we could do better at changing those standards when circumstances require it, even if that means abandoning traditions that have served for centuries. Traditions are valuable, but they're not sacred. The mission comes first, and if traditional methods aren't serving the mission, then they need to evolve." The interrogator closed her notebook and stood up. "Thank you, Captain Harrison. That concludes this portion of your assessment." As she reached the door, James called out, "Was I supposed to defend Royal Guard methods, or was I supposed to be honest about their limitations?" She turned back with something that might have been a smile. "You were supposed to demonstrate your ability to think critically about your own assumptions. I think you succeeded." Alone in the room, James reflected on what had just happened. The interrogation had been designed to break down his mental defenses, but instead, it had forced him to confront questions he had been avoiding for years. The Americans weren't just testing his physical capabilities or tactical knowledge. They were testing his ability to evolve, to question his own methods, to adapt when adaptation was necessary. And somehow, despite feeling like he had revealed weaknesses and admitted failures, James had the impression that he had just passed one of the most important tests of his career. Dawn broke grey and cold over the Georgia wilderness, as James found himself standing at the edge of what the Americans called the leadership crucible. 72 hours of continuous assessment had pushed him to the absolute limits of his physical and mental capabilities, but this final challenge looked like it might break him entirely. "Your mission," announced Major Thompson, his voice carrying across the assembled group, "is to lead a squad of international soldiers through a hostile environment to complete a strategic objective. You will have limited resources, conflicting intelligence, and approximately 6 hours before enemy reinforcements arrive." James looked at his assigned team and felt his heart sink. The squad consisted of soldiers from 7 different countries, each representing different military traditions, training methods, and command structures. Worse, none of them appeared particularly happy about being placed under British command. "Sir," said Sergeant Martinez from the US Army, "what are our rules of engagement?" "You'll figure that out as you go," Thompson replied unhelpfully. "Sometimes you'll have clear guidance, sometimes you won't. Part of leadership is making decisions with incomplete information." Thompson handed James a sealed envelope. "Your orders are inside, but be aware that objectives may change as the situation develops." James opened the envelope and read quickly. The mission was complex. Infiltrate an enemy compound, retrieve sensitive intelligence, and evacuate without detection. Standard special operations parameters, except for the part about leading an international team with no shared training background. "How long do we have to prepare?" asked Lieutenant Kim from the South Korean forces. 0 minutes, Thompson replied. "The mission starts now. Captain Harrison, your team is waiting for orders." James felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders, but this time it was different. These weren't Royal Guards trained in the same traditions and methods he knew. These were professionals from entirely different military cultures, each with their own ideas about how operations should be conducted. "Right," he said, looking at each team member in turn. "I need to know what each of you brings to this mission. Sergeant Martinez, what's your specialty?" "Urban warfare and close quarters combat, sir." "Captain Anderson?" "Reconnaissance and intelligence gathering." James worked his way through the team, cataloging their skills and capabilities. The diversity was actually impressive. Urban warfare, reconnaissance, explosives, communications, medical training, and psychological operations. If he could figure out how to coordinate their efforts, they might actually have a chance. "Our objective is intelligence retrieval from a defended compound," he explained, showing them the mission map. "We need to get in, find the target materials, and get out without triggering a full-scale response." "What kind of defenses are we facing?" asked Captain Petrov from the Russian military. "Unknown. We'll have to adapt as we encounter them." The Russian officer's expression suggested he wasn't impressed with the lack of detailed intelligence, but he nodded. "Here's how we'll approach this," James continued. "Captain Anderson, I need you to scout our route and identify potential obstacles. Sergeant Martinez, you'll plan our insertion method. Lieutenant Kim, handle communications and coordination with any support elements." "Sir," interrupted Captain Petrov, "in Russian military doctrine, we would establish a base of fire before attempting infiltration. And in Swedish doctrine, we would spend more time on reconnaissance," added Captain Anderson. James felt the challenge of international leadership hitting him immediately. Each officer had valid points based on their own training and experience, but their different approaches could easily lead to paralysis or conflict. "I appreciate all your perspectives," he said carefully, "but we need to move quickly and adapt to circumstances. I want everyone to contribute ideas, but ultimately decisions need to be made rapidly. As they began moving toward the target area, James realized that this challenge was about more than just completing a mission. It was about demonstrating leadership skills that transcended national military traditions. The compound appeared ahead of them through the morning mist, looking significantly more formidable than the intelligence briefing had suggested. Guard towers, patrol routes, and what appeared to be sophisticated sensor systems. "This is not what we were told to expect," muttered Lieutenant Kim. "Sir," said Sergeant Martinez, "I recommend we abort and call for additional resources." "Negative," James replied. "Mission parameters stated that objectives might change. We adapt and overcome." But privately, he was beginning to understand the true nature of this test. The Americans weren't just evaluating his tactical skills or leadership abilities. They were testing whether he could function effectively when every assumption proved wrong, when every plan required immediate revision. "New plan," he announced. "We're going to use our diversity as an advantage. Each of you knows different approaches to this type of problem. Instead of forcing everyone to follow British methods, we're going to use the best ideas from all our traditions." Captain Anderson looked skeptical. "That sounds like a recipe for confusion." "Maybe, but it's also the only way to succeed when standard approaches aren't working." James began assigning roles based on each soldier's national expertise rather than trying to impose a single tactical doctrine. The result was unconventional, but it also utilized capabilities that no single military tradition could provide. As they approached the compound, James realized that this final challenge was teaching him something fundamental about modern military leadership. The world was too complex, too diverse, too unpredictable for any single approach to work consistently. The question wasn't whether Royal Guard methods were superior to American methods, or whether traditional approaches were better than innovative ones. The question was whether he could synthesize the best elements from multiple sources to create solutions that worked for specific situations. With his international team moving into position, James prepared to discover whether 23 years of military service had taught him to be a leader or just a follower of established procedures. The compound loomed ahead, and with it the final test of everything he thought he knew about command, leadership, and military effectiveness. The debriefing room was silent except for the soft hum of recording equipment. James sat across from a panel of senior officers representing both American and international military leadership, their faces unreadable after reviewing 72 hours of assessment data. "Captain Harrison," began General Patricia Hayes, the senior American officer present, "we've completed our evaluation of your performance during the Ranger Assessment Program." James straightened in his chair, feeling the weight of expectation from everyone who had supported this mission. Colonel Matthews was present via video link from London, his expression tense with anticipation. "Before we discuss results," continued General Hayes, "I want to address the elephant in the room. This assessment was designed to prove a point about the limitations of traditional European military training." The admission hung in the air like an accusation. James had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was still jarring. "Our hypothesis," said Colonel Davis, the chief assessor, "was that soldiers trained primarily in ceremonial duties and traditional protocols would struggle with the adaptability demands of modern warfare." "And what did you discover?" James asked, his voice steady despite his racing heart. General Hayes consulted her notes. "We discovered that our hypothesis was both correct and completely wrong." The contradiction was confusing, and James waited for clarification. "You did struggle with certain aspects of the assessment," Colonel Davis explained. "Your initial responses to scenario changes were slower than typical Ranger candidates. You showed clear discomfort when established procedures didn't apply." James felt his stomach tighten. This sounded like the prelude to failure. "However," General Hayes continued, "you demonstrated something we rarely see in our assessments. You learned, not just adapted to individual challenges, but actually evolved your approach to leadership and problem solving in real. I don't understand." "Most candidates approach our assessment with a fixed mindset," Colonel Davis explained. "They have their methods, their training, their standard responses. When those fail, they either break down